When you think of medieval prisons, you probably imagine dark, filthy dungeons where prisoners were chained to the walls, left to rot in silence. But the truth is far stranger and far more brutal. These weren't just places of punishment. They were political weapons, public theaters, and tools of religious control. Some were run by monks, others by warlords, and inside them, what happened wasn't always about justice, it was about power. This is what medieval prisons were really like. And no, it's not what you think. When most people picture a medieval prison, one image dominates: a dark, damp dungeon buried beneath a castle, lined with iron bars, filled with shackled men left to rot for years in silence. This vision has been fed by centuries of literature, paintings, and modern films, but it's not historically accurate. In truth, the role of imprisonment in the medieval world was very different from how it is imagined today. In medieval Europe, prisons were not designed for long-term punishment. Incarceration wasn't used to serve time as it is in the modern penal system. Instead, jails and holding cells served a range of specific, often temporary purposes: holding the accused before trial, detaining debtors until repayment, coercing confessions or compliance, or keeping hostages and political prisoners under control. Prison was a tool of process, not the sentence itself. In fact, most punishments, whether for theft, murder, or rebellion, were delivered quickly and often publicly: execution, mutilation, fines, or exile. The reason is partly practical. In a time when state infrastructure was weak and expensive, to maintain, keeping prisoners locked away indefinitely was simply inefficient. Local lords and city authorities had neither the resources nor the interest in building permanent penal institutions. A prison cell required guards, space, food, and surveillance, none of which were abundant or cheap. Prisons did exist, but they came in many forms. They were not always underground. Some were rooms in castles or towers. Others were converted spaces in town halls or even churches. In England, the Tower of London was one such place, infamous, not because it resembled a horror film dungeon, but because it held high-status captives like Anne Boleyn and Sir Thomas More, often in relative comfort depending on their political value and family wealth. In France, royal prisons, like the Conciergerie in Paris, were used during the late Middle Ages as central holding facilities. But again, their purpose was usually pre-trial detention. Conditions were harsh, especially for the poor, but long-term imprisonment remained the exception, not the rule. One of the more common uses of confinement was debt imprisonment. By the 13th century, debtors across Europe could be jailed for failing to repay loans. This was not intended as a final punishment, but as leverage to force family members or associates to raise funds. In some cities, like Florence and London, dedicated debtors' prisons existed, often overcrowded and squalid, but still governed by local statutes. It was also common for prisoners to be held for ransom in the feudal world. Capturing a rival, lord or nobleman, was a financial opportunity. The prison became a tool of negotiation. One example: Richard the Lionheart, captured in 1192 on his way back from the Third Crusade, was held by Duke Leopold of Austria and later Emperor Henry VI. His ransom, 150,000 marks, was one of the largest in medieval history. He was imprisoned not out of vengeance, but for profit. Torture and cruelty certainly occurred, but these were more often tied to interrogation than to punishment by prolonged confinement. The image of a prisoner wasting away in chains for decades was rare and usually reserved for political dissidents or religious heretics. And even then, such cases were exceptional. The myth of the dungeon oversimplifies the reality. Medieval prisons were not symbols of justice or reform. They were tools of coercion, control, commerce, and, occasionally, cruelty. They served those in power and reflected the fragmented, localized nature of justice in a feudal society. The darkness wasn't just in the walls, it was in the system itself. The roots of medieval imprisonment reach back long before the Middle Ages into the legal systems of ancient Rome and the moral doctrines of early Christianity. Roman justice emphasized swift punishment, execution, exile, enslavement, or heavy fines. Prisons existed but were not used for sentencing. They were holding temporary stops before a verdict, not a place to carry it out. The casa, Rome's equivalent of a jail, was feared not for its duration, but for what came after. As the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, its legal traditions were fragmented and absorbed into the customs of newly dominant Germanic kingdoms. These tribal systems emphasized compensation and public retribution, not confinement. A crime was met with a fine, a feud, or a brutal form of corporal punishment. Locking someone away for months or years had no place in this logic. It removed the offender from the cycle of vengeance and restitution, and more importantly, it cost time and resources that few local rulers had to spare. By the early medieval period, roughly the 5th to 10th centuries, the idea of imprisonment began to evolve, not through kings or secular courts, but through the church. Monasteries, scattered across Europe, became unexpected centers of confinement. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, monks who disobeyed discipline could be isolated for reflection. This was not imprisonment as punishment, it was spiritual correction. But the idea of isolation for moral failure took root. As ecclesiastical courts gained influence, they began to apply this model to wider society. Heretics, fornicators, or those refusing penance could be detained in monastic custody. Meanwhile, castles, the power centers of feudal lords, developed their own holding spaces. These were not dungeons in the mythic sense, but repurposed rooms, towers, or cellars where captives were stored. Lords held rival nobles for ransom, extracted pledges of loyalty, or detained those awaiting trial before manorial courts. This kind of imprisonment wasn't structured, and there were no standardized facilities. It was discretionary and deeply political. City-states in Italy and parts of the Holy Roman Empire introduced another shift. As urban centers grew in the 11th and 12th centuries, so did the complexity of law enforcement. The rise of merchant guilds, town councils, and secular bureaucracies demanded new systems of order. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London began building dedicated jails facilities to house not just the accused, but those who owed debts or were involved in ongoing legal disputes. These spaces were grim, overcrowded, and often corrupt. Prisoners paid for their own food and bedding. Guards could extort bribes. But they marked a key change: the institutionalization of confinement. By the 12th century, imprisonment had moved from being a scattered, improvised tool into a more formal, if still uneven system. King Henry II of England introduced legal reforms that expanded royal authority over justice. His Assize of Clarendon in 1166 mandated the use of jails to detain suspected criminals awaiting trial by jury. These sheriff's jails became more widespread, though conditions varied drastically by region and wealth. Still, the goal of imprisonment remained clear: not rehabilitation or long-term punishment, but control. Whether for ransom, penance, or legal delay, the prison was not a solution. It was a lever one used by kings, bishops, lords, and merchants alike to maintain power, extract obedience, and enforce social order in a fragmented, volatile world. In the medieval world, not all jails were operated by kings, sheriffs, or secular courts. A surprising number were controlled by institutions with no official ties to royal authority, monasteries, and merchant guilds. These prisons didn't just detain criminals. They enforced morality, managed debts, and protected institutional interests in ways that reveal the fragmented power structures of the time. The Church, particularly during the High Middle Ages, held vast legal authority across Europe. Through canon law, it governed not just clergy, but lay people in matters ranging from marriage and blasphemy to heresy and sexual conduct. Ecclesiastical courts operated alongside secular ones, and their penalties often included confinement administered not by wardens, but by monks. Monastic prisons were typically cells within abbeys or secluded buildings on monastery grounds. Offenders weren't always criminals in the modern sense. They might be clerics who violated celibacy vows, lay people accused of heresy, or even monks themselves who disobeyed internal rules. The goal of imprisonment here was not punishment, but correction, penance through solitude. These confinements could last days, weeks, or months, depending on the severity of the offense and the authority of the abbot or bishop involved. In 1076, the Council of Winchester established clearer church authority over clergy punishment, reinforcing the Church's right to detain its own in spiritual custody. By the 12th century, these powers expanded under the influence of papal reforms, especially under Gregory VII. Heretics, apostates, and those who refused penance were increasingly imprisoned by ecclesiastical courts. The Church claimed this was a path to salvation, but in practice, it was a method of control, spiritual authority backed by physical coercion. Monastic prisons weren't always mild. Inquisitorial detentions during the 13th century could involve harsh treatment. The Inquisition, authorized by Pope Gregory IX in 1231, gave Dominican friars the power to imprison those suspected of heresy. While conditions varied, some records from Toulouse and Aragon describe inmates kept in darkness, denied outside contact, and subject to psychological pressure. The Church insisted this was in service of saving souls, but many saw it as theocratic discipline outside religious spheres. The rise of towns and commerce in the 11th and 12th centuries gave birth to a new class of non-royal jailers, merchant guilds, and civic authorities. In cities like Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck, wealthy guilds helped finance and operate local jails. These facilities served multiple purposes, holding thieves, fraudsters, and debtors, but they also protected trade routes, enforced contracts, and disciplined workers or apprentices who broke guild codes. Merchants had much at stake. A failed contract or stolen shipment could cripple a business. Rather than wait for royal courts, which were slow and often inaccessible, guilds took justice into their own hands. In some cities, they built and managed private holding cells, regulated by town charters or local councils. Debtors' prisons were especially common, with inmates sometimes jailed until families could repay the borrowed sum. These jails, run by monks and merchants, existed alongside royal prisons but operated under different rules and with different aims. Where kings used prisons for political leverage, the church and merchant class used them to maintain moral order and economic stability. They didn't need crowns to wield power. They had pulpits, contracts, and cell keys of their own. In medieval Europe, imprisonment wasn't just a matter of lit, was a transaction. Behind the stone walls and iron locks, captivity became a profitable business, often driven less by justice and more by money. Lords, jailers, city officials, and even clergy used imprisonment as a tool to extract wealth from the vulnerable, the defeated, and the accused. For the nobility, capturing enemies in battle was a lucrative opportunity. In the feudal code of warfare, a captured noble was not an inconvenience. He was an asset. One of the most famous examples came in 1356. At the Battle of Poitiers, during the 100 Years' War, the English captured King John II of France. He was treated well not out of respect, but because he was worth a fortune. His ransom, set at 7 million écus, was an astronomical sum, and the negotiations stretched over years. Hostage-taking was formalized, expected, and carefully negotiated. Entire economies were influenced by the capture and release of valuable prisoners. This practice extended down the ranks. Knights, lords, and even wealthy merchants could be held for ransom during war or feuds. In some regions, ransoming was so routine it was regulated by customary law. Captors had a financial interest in keeping prisoners alive and healthy until the payment arrived. But outside the battlefield, captivity remained no less transactional. In local jails, particularly in towns and cities, inmates paid for nearly every aspect of their confinement. Food wasn't supplied by the crown or consulate was purchased. Bedding had to be rented. If a prisoner wanted shackles removed, that too came at a price. Even basic sanitation and protection from abuse often required bribes. In England, the 13th century legal scholar Henry de Bracton noted that sheriffs and jailers frequently extorted prisoners by threatening worse conditions. Records from Newgate Prison in London show that inmates paid garnish fees to jailers just for entry into the prisoner fee that ironically added debt on top of their sentence. Those who couldn't pay were left in the worst cells, unheated, crowded, and disease-ridden. Debtors were especially vulnerable. In cities like Paris and Florence, special jails were designated for them. They had committed no violent crime, yet many remained imprisoned indefinitely until their debts were settled or someone paid on their behalf. For the jailers, this was steady income. Some institutions even operated informal menus listing prices for better rooms, meals, or access to visitors. Corruption was often unchecked. In 14th century Avignon, papal authorities investigated cases where jailers were illegally detaining individuals to extort bribes. Similar abuses were documented in the Papal States, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Holy Roman Empire. The line between justice and extortion blurred. Prisons became less about enforcing law and more about sustaining a financial ecosystem built on suffering. For the wealthy, jail could be negotiated. Money opened doors literally. Some prisoners secured private quarters, access to books, or even the right to leave under guard during the day. For the poor, captivity meant disease, hunger, and violence. Their suffering was often prolonged not by law, but by poverty. In the medieval world, justice was rarely blind. It could be bought, delayed, or reshaped depending on who held the keys and who could pay the price to unlock the door. The popular image of medieval prisons is shaped by horror stories chains, racks, iron maidens, and prisoners screaming in agony within stone walls. While torture was real and sanctioned in certain cases, the system that surrounded it was far more structured than legend suggests. Medieval justice operated through layers of procedure, paperwork, and bureaucratic control, often more meticulous than brutal. By the 13th century, many European kingdoms had begun developing formal legal systems. The growth of royal authority, especially under rulers like England's Henry II or France's Louis IX, brought new efforts to standardize justice. Local courts, manorial courts, ecclesiastical courts, and royal tribunals operated in overlapping jurisdictions. Each kept ledgers, lists of charges, witness accounts, and in some cases, inventories of the tools used for questioning. Torture was not applied arbitrarily. In most regions, it was regulated, used not as punishment, but as a method to extract confessions or uncover information. The shift toward inquisitorial procedure in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially under the influence of Roman law revival in universities like Bologna, brought formal rules to criminal investigation. Under this model, a judge could initiate an inquiry, collect evidence, and use torture only after a legal threshold had been met, typically requiring strong circumstantial evidence or multiple consistent witness testimonies. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, officially authorizing the use of torture by inquisitors against heretics. But even then, guidelines were issued: no permanent injury, no loss of life, and torture could only be applied once per case. Though this definition was stretched in practice, various devices became associated with these interrogations. The stripade, for instance, involved binding a person's hands behind their back and suspending them by a rope, sometimes with weights attached. The rack, widely used in England, stretched the body until joints dislocated. Other methods included the thumbscrew, the iron boot, or enforced sleep deprivation. These tools weren't kept in secret dungeons. They were often housed in castles or civic buildings, used under supervision and documented. Despite the existence of torture, the majority of prisoners never experienced it. For lesser crimes, theft, fraud, or debt, legal outcomes were typically resolved through trials, fines, or corporal punishment without the need for confessions under duress. In London's Guildhall or Florence's Bargello, legal clerks managed extensive records of arrests, charges, and penalties. Trials were often public, and verdicts, especially capital ones, had to be ratified by higher authorities. Public opinion toward torture varied. In some places, it was accepted as a necessary evil, particularly when used against political enemies, rebels, or religious deviants. In others, it provoked concern. In 14th century Paris, reforms were pushed by city magistrates to limit unauthorized use of torture, especially in debt disputes. And in England, the use of judicial torture was always more restricted compared to continental Europe. Common law courts relied more on juries than confessions, and torture was technically illegal unless authorized by royal warrant, something rarely granted. By the late medieval period, the process of incarceration had become paradoxical, a mixture of cruelty and control. Torture existed, but it was framed by rules, records, and legal ritual, far from the lawless violence imagined today. Many prisons operated under written codes and regulated procedures, documents that still survive in archives across Europe. Justice was painful, but it was also procedural. Behind the dungeon doors, the quill and the scroll held nearly as much power as the blade and the rope. Medieval prisons were not built for long-term sentences, but those who found themselves inside their walls often endured weeks, months, even years in conditions that were brutal, degrading, and dangerous. These were not institutions designed to rehabilitate or even to punish systematically. They were holding pens neglected, unsanitary, and deeply unequal. The suffering inside them was not distributed evenly. It followed the same social hierarchies that defined the world outside. Overcrowding was one of the most persistent features of medieval jails. In places like London's Newgate Prison, Paris's Grand Chatelet, or Florence's Stinch, dozens, sometimes hundreds of prisoners were crammed into dark, damp cells. There was little ventilation and no separation between the sick, the violent, the accused, and the condemned. Men, women, and even children were often confined together. Inmates slept on bare stone or filthy straw, often lying in their own waste. Foul smells choked the air. Fresh water was scarce, and food, when available, was basic, usually bread and water, occasionally a bit of meat or gruel. Depending on the jail's resources, disease spread easily. Lice, fleas, and rats infested the cells. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and typhus claimed lives in silence. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt in England, rebels stormed and released prisoners from the Fleet and Marshalsea prisons. Chroniclers reported that many inmates were barely alive, starved, sick, and covered in sores. Newgate, infamous by the 14th century, became a symbol of decay and neglect. Chronicler Thomas More, who would later die imprisoned himself, described its lower cells as a pit of stench and sorrow. Yet not all prisoners experienced the same misery. Status, money, and influence could buy better treatment. Wealthy inmates often negotiated with jailers for private cells, bedding, firewood, and even the right to receive visitors. Some arranged to have meals delivered from outside, or to hire servants from among fellow prisoners. In Florence, records from the 14th century show that influential debtors confined in the Stinch could pay for access to the upper floors, where windows and fresh air offered relief from the squalor below. Bribery was common. Jailers, underpaid and unregulated, exploited every opportunity. Entry fees, release fees, and even daily payments for lighter chains or cleaner rooms were extorted regularly. A prisoner who couldn't pay could end up shackled to the wall, deprived of light, or forgotten entirely in underground cells known as oubliettes. In France, these pits were sometimes accessed only through a hatch in the ceiling. Once dropped in, escape was nearly impossible without help from above. Violence within the walls was frequent. With no guards stationed inside many cells, stronger inmates preyed on the weak. Fights over space, food, or scraps of clothing were routine. Sexual assault, though rarely recorded explicitly in official documents, is implied in court testimonies and letters from the period. The mentally ill were thrown in with the rest, untreated and often abused. There was no medical care, no structured oversight, and little chance of appeal. A prisoner could die before ever facing trial. Despite the chaos, some prisons maintained rudimentary systems of self-governance. In certain jails, inmates elected a prisoner's governor to manage internal disputes or liaise with authorities. In London's Marshalsea, this figure collected bribes and mediated between factions. It was a crude hierarchy, but one that mimicked the world outside the walls. What these conditions reveal is that medieval imprisonment was not simply a legal response to crime. It was a reflection of feudal society itself. Rank determined survival. The powerful endured. The powerless were left to rot. And the jailer standing between both used the suffering of others to secure his own comfort. Hell on earth wasn't A metaphor. For many prisoners, it was a real place, with cold stone floors, locked iron doors, and the silence of a world that had already forgotten them. In the medieval world, justice was not hidden behind walls. It was staged in the open, in marketplaces, town squares, and churchyards, deliberately public, deliberately humiliating, while the wealthy could often negotiate private confinement. The vast majority of people, especially peasants and laborers, faced punishment under the eyes of their neighbors. Public spectacle wasn't a side effect of justice. It was the main event. Stocks and pillories were among the most common tools of this public discipline. The stocks immobilized a prisoner's feet, while the pillory locked their head and hands in place. Offenders were exposed for hours or days, sometimes longer. Passers-by were not just permitted, but encouraged to jeer, mock, and throw refuse. In Norwich, court rolls from the 14th century list dozens of such punishments for minor offences: selling bad ale, breaking curfew, gossiping about the local clergy. The shame was the sentence. Flogging, too, was performed in full view. Whippings were often announced in advance, drawing crowds from surrounding villages. In Paris, condemned men were marched through the streets before their lashes were administered on bridges or near city gates. These events served both as warning and ritual, a demonstration of authority by those who held it, and a reminder of consequences for those who didn't. Executions were theatrical by design. In England, Tyburn became infamous for its hangings. By the 13th century, it was common for executions to be scheduled on market days to ensure maximum attendance. Spectators brought food, drank, and watched. The condemned were sometimes paraded through the streets beforehand, reciting confessions or prayers. The goal was not just punishment, but submission, reinforcing the power of the crown. The church, or the local lord, beheadings, burnings, and dismemberments were reserved for crimes deemed exceptional: treason, heresy, or sorcery. In 1431, Joan of Arc was burned alive in Rouen marketplace. Her execution wasn't carried out in secrecy, but in front of thousands. Authorities feared her influence even in death. They burned her body 3 times, then scattered the ashes in the Seine, ensuring no relics could be gathered. No martyrdom myth sustained. Contrast this with how the elite were handled. Nobles and clergy were more likely to face imprisonment than mutilation or death. Their punishments were quieter, conducted in castles, monasteries, or under house arrest. When the Duke of Burgundy imprisoned King Charles VI's brother in the early 15th century, it was not done in chains or the public square, but behind guarded doors, far from public outrage. This divide was deliberate. Public punishment reinforced social hierarchies. It reminded the poor of their place and the consequences of defiance. It gave the public a role not as jurors, but as witnesses to authority. Meanwhile, imprisonment, costly, hidden, and often negotiable, was reserved for those with resources, titles, or influence. Justice was not equal. It was performed in a world without mass media. These spectacles shaped public memory. They created fear, awe, and compliance. The lash, the rope, and the jeering crowd were tools, not just of punishment, but of governance. The message was clear. Punishment was meant to be seen, and justice was meant to be obeyed. The Tower of London was never built to be a prison. William the Conqueror raised it in the 11th century as a fortress, a symbol of Norman dominance. Yet by the late Middle Ages, its high walls and stone chambers became England's most feared place of confinement. Over time, the Tower held a growing list of political prisoners, nobles, queens, spies, and dissenters. In 1471, during the Wars of the Roses, Henry VI was imprisoned there, and later found dead, most likely murdered on the orders of Edward IV. In 1536, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was locked in the Queen's house before her beheading on Tower Green. The same fate awaited her cousin, Catherine Howard, 6 years later. These were not peasants or criminals. They were women of the court, sentenced by power struggles, locked behind royal stone. But the tower also housed lesser-known captives. In the 16th century, Thomas Abel, a Catholic priest, was imprisoned for opposing the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He spent years in the tower before execution. Records show he shared space with Protestant heretics, foreign spies, and debtors, men and women held not for violence, but for crossing religious or political lines. Far to the south, off the coast of Marseille, the Château d'If became France's island fortress prison. Constructed in 1524 under King Francis I, it was never tested in war. Instead, it held those deemed too dangerous or too inconvenient for mainland justice. Protestants, during the French Wars of Religion, were confined there, often without trial. In the 17th century, those accused of sorcery or sedition were brought in by boat, locked in cells carved into thick stone, while the Château d'If later gained fame through fiction thanks to Alexandre Dumas and the Count of Monte Cristo. Its real inmates left little behind. Few escaped. Most died within its walls, their names preserved only in arrest logs and church burial registers. In Italy, Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome had a similar transformation. Built as a mausoleum for Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, it became a papal fortress in the medieval period. By the 14th century, it served as a prison for political enemies of the Vatican. During the sack of Rome in 1527, Pope Clement VII took refuge there, while enemies of the Church, many of them reformist thinkers or rival clerics, were left imprisoned in its lower chambers. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher and former Dominican friar, was held by the Roman Inquisition for years, before being burned at the stake in 1600. While not all of his detention was spent inside Castel Sant'Angelo, it represented the broader machinery of religious imprisonment, where heresy, rather than crime, was the charge that sealed one's fate. Outside these famous walls, thousands of unnamed prisoners suffered and vanished. In towns across Europe, Rouen, Cologne, Bruges city records mention bakers jailed for short waits, beggars imprisoned for vagrancy, and women locked up on accusations of prostitution or witchcraft. Their cells were small, unlit, and forgotten. No monuments commemorate them. No chronicles retell their stories. In 14th century Lubeck, a mother was detained with her child after her husband defaulted on a merchant contract. In Avignon, papal guards imprisoned a mason for speaking against a local bishop. In Dublin, records show entire families jailed over unpaid rents. These people were not traitors or rebels. They were poor, unlucky, or inconvenient. The medieval prison was not just for the famous or the damned. It was also a place where ordinary people disappeared, caught between power and law, punishment and silence. Some were remembered because of scandal. Most were forgotten because they mattered to no one. But their absence still shaped the world outside their walls. By the late 15th century, the medieval prison was beginning to lose its grip, not through revolution, but through reform, pressure, and shifting ideology. The world was changing as feudal structures weakened and Renaissance thought spread across Europe. So too did new questions about justice, punishment, and the role of the state. The age of the dungeon was ending not with sudden abolition, but through slow erosion on many parts of Europe. Prison reform began not with mercy, but with management. City-states and kingdoms increasingly saw crime not just as sin or rebellion, but as a threat to social order that required more predictable handling. Secular courts, often influenced by emerging bureaucratic governments, began to favor structured penalties over arbitrary violence in England. By the early 16th century, institutions like Bridewell Palace in London, originally a royal residence, repurposed into correctional houses. In 1553, under Edward VI, Bridewell became a house of correction for disorderly women and idle apprentices. It marked a key turning point: confinement as reform, not simply detention. Offenders were expected to work, repent, and return to society reformed, at least in theory. Elsewhere, similar institutions took root. In Amsterdam, the spinhuis for women and rasvuis for men opened in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. These facilities emphasized labor, discipline, and moral education. Prisoners spun yarn, rasped wood, and attended sermons. Surveillance was tighter, rules more defined. Brutality was still present, but cloaked in administrative language and justified as moral correction. This transformation gained momentum in the 18th century, fueled by Enlightenment thinkers who challenged the legitimacy of public torture and spectacle. In 1764, Cesare Beccaria published On Crimes and Punishments, a groundbreaking critique of arbitrary justice. He argued that punishments should be proportional, predictable, and above all, humane. His ideas spread rapidly, influencing legal reform in France, Austria, and beyond. Public executions began to decline. While still common in many regions, the spectacle was increasingly seen as distasteful and counterproductive. In Sweden, the last execution in Stockholm's public square took place in the 1860s. In England, the final public hanging was in 1868. Long before that, the movement had begun to remove punishment from the public eye and place it behind institutional walls. The modern prison began to take shape: cleaner, more structured, but no less controlling. Isolation replaced humiliation. Silence replaced the roar of crowds. The penitentiary, rooted in the idea of repentance through solitude, emerged in places like Philadelphia and London. Cells were no longer filthy corners of a castle. They were standardized, monitored, and designed for introspection. Compared to the horrors of medieval dungeons, disease-ridden, chaotic, and fueled by extortion, these reforms were significant. But the shift wasn't just architectural. It reflected a deeper change. From punishment as vengeance to punishment as management, from public dominance to private correction, the dungeon had not disappeared. It had been redefined. Its purpose had shifted. Its rituals changed. Its violence made more discreet. But behind the new walls and well-written codes, power still lingered. Now it wore the robes of reform. Medieval imprisonment was not designed to deliver justice in the modern sense. It was not about rehabilitation or proportional punishment. It was a mirror reflecting who held power, who didn't, and what that imbalance looked like when stripped to its rawest form. Most medieval prisons were not meant to contain the guilty. They were built to silence the inconvenient, the debtor who owed too much, the rival noble captured in battle, the priest who spoke too freely, the merchant who challenged a tax. In each case, the act of confinement wasn't just a legal response, it was a political maneuver, and it always favored those with access to wealth, rank, or institutional protection. For kings and nobles, imprisonment was leverage. A captured enemy wasn't just neutralized, he became a source of income, a bargaining chip, or a message to others. When Richard the Lionheart was captured on his return from the Crusades in 1192, his ransom 150,000 marks nearly bankrupted England. His value wasn't determined by guilt, but by how much he was worth alive and behind bars. For the church, prisons reinforced moral and doctrinal authority. Heretics and dissenters were confined not only to prevent rebellion, but to extract public submission. Silence was mistaken for guilt. Compliance was demanded in exchange for release. The Inquisition didn't need to execute every accused heretic. The threat of prolonged spiritual isolation, backed by the slow machinery of ecclesiastical law, often did the job more effectively. But for the poor, the powerless, and the unknown, prison was something else entirely. It was punishment without verdict, suffering without trial. Across Europe, jail became a tool for landlords, guilds, and civic officials to extract labor, crush resistance, and maintain economic order. Debtors, in particular, bore the weight of this system. They weren't dangerous, they were disposable. Imprisonment in the medieval world reveals how little agency most people had over their fate. Trials were inconsistent, conditions were brutal, outcomes were often tied more to status than to law, and yet the system persisted because it worked for those who designed it. What a society does with its unwanted says more than any royal charter or church decree. When it chooses to display punishment in the town square, but hide confinement in forgotten towers, it signals where it wants fear and where it prefers silence. When the wealthy pay for better cells while the poor sleep in filth, it shows who the system was built to protect. The dungeon may have vanished, but the questions remain. Who builds the prisons? Who profits from their use? And who, in the end, is left to rot behind the door? In the Middle Ages, prison wasn't a solution. It was a method of control, of intimidation, of power in its rawest, most unapologetic form. Not blind justice, but calculated enforcement. And that distinction made all the difference.